Leo had grown used to silence in the heart of a frozen wilderness. His wooden cabin stood like a forgotten memory, tucked between thick pine trees and miles of untouched snow. The outside world barely existed for him anymore. Days passed without voices, without footsteps, only the wind whispering through the trees and the occasional howl of a distant wolf. But on that particular morning, something felt wrong. The silence was too heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. He had woken early, his breath visible even inside the cabin. He lit a fire, wrapped himself in his thickest coat, and stepped outside to gather firewood. That was when he saw it. Just beyond the edge of the trees, where the forest met the clearing, stood a massive bear. Not moving, not growling, just standing there, half covered in frost, staring directly at him. For a moment, Leo didn't move. He had lived in these woods long enough to know the habits of wild animals. They didn't behave like this. A bear would usually avoid human contact, and if it did come near, it would do so with aggression or hunger. But this bear did neither. It didn't approach, didn't retreat, it simply stood there, its thick fur caked with snow, its body stiff and unmoving, as though frozen, not just by the cold, but by something deeper. Leo narrowed his eyes. The bear's gaze was fixed on him, not threatening, but strangely intense. There was no rage in those eyes, no hunger, just something quiet and urgent. Something that made Leo feel like the bear was not just looking at him, but trying to reach him. He slowly backed toward his door, never breaking eye contact. The bear did not react. Once inside, he watched through the frosted window. Minutes passed, and the bear didn't leave. By noon, it was still there. Leo's fingers drummed nervously on the windowsill. He told himself to ignore it, it would leave eventually, wild animals always did. But something about this felt different. He made himself tea, tried to read a book, even fiddled with the old radio, but the image of the bear would not leave his mind. He found himself glancing out the window every few minutes, and every time, the bear was still there, still watching. The sky turned gray by late afternoon, and flakes of snow began to fall again, swirling in slow spirals outside the window. The bear didn't move. It looked more like a statue than a living creature. Leo began to feel an unease that settled deep in his bones, not from fear, but from a strange sort of sadness. Why wasn't the bear moving? Was it injured, lost, or was it waiting for something? As night began to fall, Leo stepped out again, this time holding a flashlight. He didn't get too close, just stood on the edge of his porch and watched. The bear blinked slowly, its body seemed to tremble slightly now, not with rage, but with cold or maybe exhaustion. Still, it did not step forward. Leo felt a strange pull in his chest. It wasn't pity, it was something older, something primal, a recognition. He left a small portion of leftover stew on a flat stone near the tree line, then returned inside. Through the window, he saw the bear finally shift. It moved forward slowly, sniffed the food, and then ate. Not hungrily, not with wild force, but carefully, respectfully. And once it finished, it returned to its place at the forest edge. That night, Leo barely slept. When he did, his dreams were full of thick forests, echoing growls, and deep golden eyes watching him from the shadows. Morning came, pale and bitter. Snow had piled high along the porch rail, and frost clung to the windows like lace. Leo rose before dawn, and before he even opened the curtain, the bear was still there. And this time, it was closer, just a few steps beyond the porch. Leo stared at it for a long time. He wasn't afraid anymore, not really. Something was happening, something beyond understanding, and it had started with a silent visitor. He opened the door slightly and stepped outside, boots crunching against the snow. The bear did not move. Their eyes met again. Leo didn't speak, he just stood there, heart pounding, breath visible in the icy air. He was beginning to understand, this wasn't just a wild animal. It was a call, a plea, and whatever the bear wanted, it wasn't going to stop until Leo listened. The next morning came with a gray sky and an eerie stillness, the kind of quiet that made every sound feel louder than it should. Leo hesitated before pulling back the curtain. Part of him hoped the bear would be gone, another part already knew it would still be there. And it was, standing in nearly the same place as the day before. The bear watched the cabin with steady eyes. It didn't flinch when Leo appeared at the window. It simply remained still, its thick fur layered with frost, the snow beneath it barely disturbed, a statue of patience in the cold. Over the next few days, this silent pattern repeated. Every morning, the bear was there. It never growled, never approached aggressively, just waited. Leo left food out again, unsure if he should, unsure of the risk, but each time, the bear accepted it without chaos or noise. It ate with care, with an almost eerie calm. When finished, it would return to its usual spot, lower itself into the snow, and stare at the cabin until dusk. The behavior didn't make sense. It went against everything Leo had read or experienced about wild animals. Bears were unpredictable, especially during winter. Yet this one behaved as though it understood boundaries, as if it had chosen Leo for a reason and was now waiting for him to see why. Leo tried to stay distant at first. He reminded himself it was just a bear, a wild creature following instincts. But slowly, something shifted. He started talking aloud while watching it from the window, even if the words were mostly for himself. He'd say things like, "I don't know what you want," or "You're not supposed to be here." It made no difference. The bear just watched. On the 6th day, the sky cracked open with a heavy snowstorm. The winds howled through the trees like voices from another world. Leo didn't expect the bear to appear that morning. The cold was cruel, biting through thick layers and freezing breath in seconds. Yet, when he peeked out into the storm, he saw the outline, faint but present, of the bear standing just beyond the cabin. That day, something inside Leo changed. He no longer felt like a host to an intruder. He felt like a witness to something ancient and unspoken. He prepared a larger meal, placing it in the usual spot. The bear accepted it as always, giving Leo one long look before retreating to its snowy post. That night, Leo sat by the fire for hours, replaying every moment since the first sighting. He could feel something building, pressing at the edges of his quiet life. Then came the 7th night. The fire was dying, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Leo was just about to retire when he heard it, a low, steady sound, a soft thump against wood. He froze. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the snow falling from trees. It was close. It was rhythmic. It was deliberate. Leo stepped cautiously to the door and placed his hand on the handle. He hesitated for a long moment before opening it. There, just feet away, was the bear, not at the edge of the woods, not in its usual spot, but at his porch, standing before the door, its large paw gently pressing against the wood again and again, not with violence, not with demand, but with meaning. Their eyes met once more. This time, Leo didn't feel like the observer, he felt like the one being watched. With hope, the bear lowered its paw, turned slowly, and began to walk away, pausing to glance back once. Leo's heart pounded. His instincts screamed to stay inside, but something deeper, something silent and unexplainable, urged him forward. He stepped outside. The cold immediately bit through his clothes. The bear stopped, waited, then continued walking slowly and deliberately deeper into the forest. Leo followed. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he stepped off his porch and into the cold. The wind nipped at his skin, sharp and unforgiving, but he hardly noticed. His eyes remained fixed on the massive creature ahead of him, trudging slowly through the snow-covered forest. The bear walked with purpose, stopping every so often to make sure Leo was still behind. It didn't growl, it didn't run. It simply led. Trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with snow. The world was hushed by the thick white blanket that covered everything. The deeper they went, the quieter it became. There were no birds, no rustling of animals, just the sound of snow underfoot and the steady breath of two unlikely companions. Leo had no idea how long they had been walking. Time seemed to stretch and bend in the cold. His legs ached, his face stung, but he kept going, driven by something stronger than curiosity. Now, the bear had sought him out. It had waited day after day, and now it was showing him something. Finally, the bear slowed. They had reached a clearing, smaller than Leo expected, hidden deep within the forest. And in the center of it, nearly lost beneath snow drifts and vines, was a wooden structure. It was old, sunken slightly into the earth, the roof half collapsed under the weight of snow. It didn't look like a den or a cave, it looked like something man-made, maybe a cabin or an outpost from years long gone. The bear moved toward it, circling the front entrance with growing restlessness. Its massive head pushed at the side of the structure. Its breath was visible in the cold as it paced. Every few steps, it turned to look at Leo, eyes filled with something close to panic. Then it moved to what must have once been a door, now crooked and nearly frozen shut. The bear raised a paw and began to scratch at it, not with force, but with urgency. Leo stepped closer, his heart pounding. He could see now that this place wasn't abandoned completely. The wood was worn but not rotted. The snow around the entrance was disturbed, scattered with prints. This place had seen recent life. He moved to the door and placed his hands on it. It didn't budge. Ice sealed it shut, years of storms and cold locking it tight. The bear let out a low sound, not a growl, but a strained noise that sent a shiver through Leo's spine. It wasn't angry. It was scared. Bracing himself, Leo pressed his shoulder against the door and shoved. The wood creaked under the pressure. He tried again, using both hands now, wedging his foot into the snow for leverage. The door groaned but held firm. The bear backed away, giving him space, watching with wide eyes. Leo reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small metal wedge he carried for firewood splitting. He dug at the ice along the edges, chipping away, ignoring the sting in his fingers. Finally, with one last push, the door cracked open. A gust of stale, cold air rushed out, thick with the scent of damp wood and something else, something faintly warm, like life clinging to a dying ember. The bear didn't wait, it rushed past him, slipping through the narrow gap and disappearing into the dark interior. Leo followed quickly, flashlight in hand. Inside, the space was cramped and dim. Shelves lined the walls, filled with old containers and scattered supplies, but it wasn't the furniture that caught his eye. In the corner, lying against a bed of torn blankets and pine needles, was another bear, smaller, thinner, breathing heavily. Its fur was matted, stained with blood and frost. Beside it, huddled close, were two tiny cubs, unmoving but still breathing. The male bear moved to them immediately, pressing its head against the mother's side, then nudging the cubs gently with its nose. Leo froze. The truth settled over him like the weight of snow. This was not just a shelter, this was a home. The bear had brought him here, not for food, not for warmth, but for help. The family was dying, and it had tried Leo, the only human it had ever approached, to save them. The air inside the shelter was thick with cold, but also something else, something heavy and urgent. Leo stood at the threshold, barely able to move. The flashlight in his hand shook slightly as he tried to process what he was seeing. The mother bear lay curled on her side, her breathing shallow. Every rise and fall of her chest was a struggle. Her fur was tangled and soaked with dried blood. One of her front legs appeared twisted, maybe broken, and frost had crept up her back like a slow, creeping shadow. The two cubs, nestled against her belly, were no bigger than bundles of fur. They didn't move when the light hit them. For one terrifying moment, Leo thought they were gone, but then he saw the faintest twitch in one of their ears, a slow breath rising in a shiver. They were alive, but just barely. The father bear moved carefully around them, nudging each cub, then brushing his head against the injured mother's neck. He let out a low, rumbling sound, filled with sorrow and fear. He looked back at Leo, eyes shining in the dim light. It was not a demand. It was not a threat. It was a plea. Leo knelt slowly, his heartbeat thudding in his ears. He had lived in the wilderness long enough to respect wild animals, but this was different. This wasn't about rules or survival, this was about something deeper, something almost human. He stepped closer, heart pounding, watching the father bear carefully, but the bear didn't stop him. It stayed near the mother, never taking its eyes off her, allowing Leo to move into the space like he belonged there. That unspoken trust hit Leo hard. He reached out and touched the cold fur of one of the cubs. Its body was far too cold. He knew if they stayed here much longer, they wouldn't survive the night. And the mother, she needed warmth, rest, and time to heal. But out here, in this abandoned den, time was running out. Leo stood, the weight of the moment sinking deep into his chest. His mind was racing, trying to figure out what he could carry, how far he could go, what supplies he had back at the cabin. He had to act quickly. There was no choice. He turned back toward the door, pausing just long enough to meet the father bear's gaze again. Something unspoken passed between them, a silent agreement. Leo would try. He would not turn away. As he stepped outside, the cold wind sliced at his face, but he hardly noticed. His cabin was far, maybe an hour's hike in the snow, but he had blankets, heated stones, food, everything they needed to survive if he could get them there. He returned quickly with the supplies, stuffing his arms with what he could carry, 2 thick wool blankets, a heated pouch of stones from his fireplace wrapped tightly, a canvas sling he had used once to carry firewood, now ready for something far more precious. One by one, he gently placed the cubs into the sling. They were light, barely moving, but still breathing. He wrapped them carefully, tucking the heated stones around their fragile bodies. The father bear watched silently, his massive frame towering in the corner, but he did not interfere. Then came the mother. Moving her would be dangerous, but Leo knew she couldn't stay here. He brought the second blanket over her, speaking softly under his breath, even though he knew she couldn't understand. He wrapped the blanket gently, then took one of the old wooden planks from the wall and turned it into a makeshift sled. With rope and cloth, he bound her gently but securely, careful not to jostle her injuries. The father bear came closer, nudging her as if to reassure her. Then, to Leo's surprise, he placed himself at the front of the sled, gripping the rope in his powerful jaws. Together, they began the slow, painful journey back. The snow was deep, the path narrow, and the wind relentless, but they moved steadily. Leo, carrying the sling of cubs, and the father bear, pulling the sled behind him, made for a strange sight. A man and a beast working side by side, not out of necessity, but something more. Every step Leo took stirred something in him, a memory, a loss. Years ago, he had a family of his own, a wife who loved the snow, who laughed in the quiet of winter, a daughter who ran barefoot through the cabin, drawing bears on scraps of paper. Then, one winter, they were gone, lost in a storm while he had been away gathering wood. He had never forgiven himself, never allowed himself to heal. But now, in this moment, he felt something shift. This bear had lost nearly everything, and somehow, in saving this broken family, Leo was finding his way back from the edge of grief. The journey back to the cabin was slow and difficult. Snow fell in steady sheets, and the cold grew sharper as the sun disappeared behind heavy clouds. Leo walked carefully, holding the sling close to his chest. The cubs were light and fragile, their bodies barely warm despite the heated stones tucked around them. He kept glancing down, watching for movement, for breath, for any sign of life. Every tiny twitch gave him strength to keep going. Behind him, the father bear moved with quiet determination, pulling the makeshift sled with the injured mother wrapped tightly in blankets. There was no hesitation in his steps, only steady, silent resolve. Every few paces, he paused to check her, brushing his head gently against her fur before pressing forward again. In those moments, Leo saw something deeper than instinct. He saw love. By the time they reached the cabin, night had fully settled in. The wood stood dark and silent behind them, and the snow piled high around the porch. Leo pushed the door open and stepped inside, the sudden warmth wrapping around him like a blanket. He cleared space near the fire, laying out soft bedding made of old rugs, quilts, and furs. He placed the cubs down first, carefully removing the sling and tucking them into the warmth. Their small chests rose and fell slowly, but the cold no longer clung to them like it had before. The father bear stopped just outside the door, the sled still tied to him. He looked toward the cabin, then back at Leo. There was a quiet hesitation in his eyes, a line he would not cross. Wild animals didn't enter human homes, not even in desperation. Leo stepped out and helped untie the sled, then carefully lifted the mother bear with all the gentleness he could manage. The father bear watched every movement but made no sound. When Leo brought her inside and laid her beside the fire, he turned and found the bear still at the threshold, staring in. Leo opened the door wider and stepped aside. The bear did not come in. Instead, he lowered himself onto the porch, just beside the door, curled his body into the snow, and settled there as if he belonged to the house. He would not leave, not until his family was safe inside. Leo worked quickly, boiling water, warming broth, and mixing a small blend of crushed oats and dried berries. He fed the cubs slowly, using a cloth to dab warmth into their mouths. The first night, they hardly moved. The mother barely stirred, but the cabin was warm, and Leo kept the fire burning bright. By morning, one of the cubs opened its eyes. Leo sat beside them, exhaustion pulling at his bones, but a faint smile touched his lips. He hadn't smiled in years, not like this. He reached out and brushed the fur of the small creature, so light and helpless, and it pressed against his hand with the softest sound. The days that followed moved in a quiet rhythm. Leo cared for the cubs, cleaning their fur, warming their bodies, and feeding them by hand. He dressed the mother bear's wound as best he could, using the same herbs and bandages he once stored for himself. She remained still most of the time, but her breathing improved, steadier with each passing night. Outside, the father bear never left the porch. He remained curled near the door, snow piling on his back during the nights, melting away each morning under the soft rays of the sun. He didn't move unless it was to look through the window or listen to the faint cries of the cubs. Leo began to speak to him, not expecting answers but sharing updates, thoughts, and memories, things he had kept locked away for years. Something unspoken passed between them, a quiet understanding, a bond that needed no words. Leo hadn't let anyone in since the loss of his wife and daughter. He had chosen silence, distance, isolation. But now his home was full again, full of small breaths, quiet rustles, and the heavy sound of hope returning. By the end of the week, the cubs were moving on their own, stumbling around the cabin, curling against each other in sleep. The mother bear opened her eyes for the first time since arriving, and though she didn't move much, she watched Leo with a calm, tired gaze. Leo sat beside her and nodded, as if assuring her that everything was going to be all right. Outside, the snow began to melt, and still, the father bear watched. Spring didn't arrive all at once. It came gently, in quiet steps that whispered change across the forest. The ice that once gripped the trees began to soften, dripping steadily from heavy branches. The harsh winds grew warmer, carrying scents of fresh soil and early blossoms. Streams, once frozen solid, began to trickle with clear water, weaving life back into the land. The snow retreated, not in defeat, but as if it knew its time had passed, and in its place, green pushed forward, timid at first, then bold and unstoppable. For Leo, the shift in season stirred something deep within him. His world, once encased in grief and silence, now pulsed with quiet life. He would wake each morning to birdsong rather than the howl of winter winds. The cabin, which had once felt like a monument to loneliness, now held the echo of movement, of breath, of healing. Inside, the cubs had transformed. No longer fragile and weak, they were now playful bundles of energy, curious about everything. They nosed at Leo's boots, tumbled over each other, and explored every inch of the cabin with the unfiltered wonder of youth. Their fur had grown thick and golden, their bodies strong. Their eyes, once dull with cold, now sparkled with mischief and life. The mother bear, once too injured to move, now walked with grace. Her limp had faded to a barely noticeable stiffness. She would rest near the porch during the day, basking in the sunlight, her gaze always watchful, always calm. Leo often caught her watching him, her eyes steady and knowing, as if silently thanking him each time their paths crossed. And the father bear, he remained ever present, never entering the cabin, never wandering too far. He stayed near, either at the edge of the clearing or lying on the porch, his massive body a quiet constant. He had become a guardian, not only to his family but to Leo as well. Their bond had deepened beyond understanding. No words had ever passed between them, but none were needed. They had spoken through actions, through silent presence, through shared purpose. Leo found himself speaking more often these days, not to other people, for there were none, but to the trees, to the wind, to the fire crackling in the hearth, and sometimes to the bears. He shared thoughts he had buried long ago. He spoke of the day he first met his wife, of her laugh, of the way she used to braid her hair before going outside. He spoke of their daughter, of the small song she used to hum, of how she loved to follow deer tracks in the snow and believe fairies lived in pine cones. He hadn't spoken of them in years. He hadn't allowed himself to. But now, with the bears around him, listening with stillness that felt almost sacred, the memories didn't feel so sharp. They were gentle now, like faded photographs pulled from a forgotten drawer, warm with age and meaning. Then, one morning, Leo knew. He stepped outside just as the sun lifted over the trees, painting the sky in shades of gold and peach. The air was fresh, filled with the scent of melting earth and new grass. The forest, once frozen in time, now breathed with life. The bear family stood at the edge of the clearing. The cubs stood tall and strong, ready for the world. The mother, healed, calm, stood beside them with quiet pride, and the father bear, towering and still, locked eyes with Leo just as he had that first morning. There was something final in his gaze, something steady and certain. Leo took a slow breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle in his chest. There was no ceremony, no sound, only the hush of nature, the gentle stirring of leaves, the slow pulse of life continuing on. The bears turned, one by one. They walked into the forest, no rush, no hesitation, just the quiet departure of something extraordinary. Leo watched them until the last flick of a tail vanished between the trees. And then he stood alone, but it was not the loneliness of the past. It was not the heavy emptiness that had haunted him for years. This solitude was different. It was full of memory, full of meaning, full of the invisible thread that now connected him to something greater than himself. He returned to the cabin and sat by the fire, not in silence but in peace. Days turned into weeks, and the forest bloomed fully into spring. Wildflowers painted the hills, birds filled the sky, and the world outside the cabin pulsed with renewal. Leo welcomed it. He kept the porch clear just in case, left scraps of berries and honey on the stones outside, just in case. And sometimes, in the early morning, when the sun was barely touching the treetops, he would find paw prints. Not many, just a few, large and soft, pressed gently into the soil near the porch. He never saw the bear again, not fully. Sometimes he thought he saw a shape in the trees, a flicker of movement too large to be anything else, but it was never confirmed, and he was fine with that. He didn't need to see them to know they were out there because the bond they had formed, that quiet, miraculous trust, was not bound by distance. It did not require presence. It had become a part of him. Leo changed after that winter, not in loud ways. He didn't leave the woods or seek out the noise of the world, but inside, he was new. He found purpose again in the rhythm of days, in the tending of his garden, in the writing of his thoughts in a worn leather journal. He spoke to the trees as he walked, hummed songs he once thought he had forgotten. He even carved small wooden figures, bears, cubs, a man standing among them, and placed them on the windowsill where the light touched them every morning. The scarf the bear had returned remained by the fire, folded carefully on the mantel. Sometimes he would hold it close, close his eyes, and feel not grief but gratitude for what had been lost and what had been found. That winter had changed everything. It had begun with silence, with a frozen figure standing in the snow, eyes full of something no man could explain. And it ended with life, with healing, with the quiet understanding between two souls from different worlds brought together by need, held together by something even stronger than fear, hope. The forest had taken so much from Leo, but in the end, it had also given something back. Not a replacement, but a reason, and that reason echoed in the prints by his door, in the laughter of wind through trees, in the warmth of a fire that never quite went out. If this story moved your heart even a little, consider subscribing to our channel. We share tales that remind us of the beauty in the unexpected, the hope in quiet places, and the powerful connections that exist all around us. Your support helps us continue bringing these true and heartfelt stories to life, one moment at a time.